It's really unfortunate in our society that women in particular, that we have to sort of bleed for people to pay attention. You have to be willing to put your darkest secrets out there. You have to be willing to show the emotional pain and the damage for people to pay attention, that we don't just listen to people when they tell us that something happened.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back for episode 67. Thanks to everyone for being so patient in waiting for this episode. It's been over 3 weeks since the last episode, and I try to do these bi-weekly, so thank you so much for your patience. And before I jump into the introduction for today's guest, a very important message, especially for those listeners who are in Wisconsin. Today's guest is trying to raise awareness regarding two bills in the state of Wisconsin that are important. The first bill is the Clergy Mandatory Reporter Act, which would require members of the clergy in Wisconsin to report all instances of child abuse, including sexual abuse, to law enforcement. Currently in the state of Wisconsin, there's an exception for religious clergy and religious leaders. That plays a huge role in my guest's story today, and is playing a part in many other stories out there right now. So it would be really helpful if folks who live in Wisconsin are able to either write letters or pick up the phone and express their support to their local state representatives for this bill, for this act, particularly if your representative happens to be Republican. For some reason, Republican representatives are not as supportive of this bill as their Democratic counterparts. So we want to raise awareness about this. We want to get the word out to help. This bill is being considered right now, so they're trying to build up support for it. So this is a really great time to do what you can, just express your support for the bill. The other bill that is being considered right now is called the Child Victims Act, which would remove the civil statute of limitations for sexual abuse cases in the state of Wisconsin. This would allow victims to pursue legal action against perpetrators after the age of 35. It would also allow a window for any victim who was previously not allowed to pursue that action under the law to do so within 3 years of the passage of the bill. So, the Child Victims Act, the one I just mentioned, and then also the first one, the Clergy Mandatory Reporter Act, both very important and both something that my guest today wants to raise awareness about. Like I said, if you live in Wisconsin and you can pick up the phone or write a letter to your representative, particularly if they're Republican, that would be a huge help. And we appreciate that you do that. So I just want to give a content warning before I introduce today's guest that we discuss sexual abuse and we discuss grooming and things like that throughout the episode at different times. If that's something that is difficult for you to listen to, or you're triggered by that type of by this subject in particular, I just wanted to let you know before the episode begins. For those of you who are able to listen to this episode, it's such an important message, and I was so grateful and I'm honored that she was willing to share her story with me and with all of you. It was just such a pleasure to speak with her. I just really enjoyed the conversation. A sweet, kind, wonderful person, and was really grateful to meet her and get to know her, and just want to do everything I can to help kind of promote these bills that she's fighting for, and also just to get her message out. She is a lifelong resident of Wisconsin and attended a United Pentecostal church from about the age of 7 to the age of 17. During that time, she was exposed to sexual abuse and ideas that caused serious religious trauma. Now she is working to try to help others cope with their trauma and raise awareness about the organization that she grew up in. She's an amazing person. Here's my conversation with Debbie McNulty. I'd like to welcome Debbie McNulty to the podcast. Debbie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah, this is going to be an exciting story to get into. So, now you had said that you considered yourself Neo-Pagan. What's that mean to you? How would you define that for someone?
Well, I will tell you, and we can come back to it, that I did try to be atheist for about 3 months.
Okay. Sounds good.
I think it was more that I was just really angry.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought it was. I understand differently now.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I believe that I am part of the divine, much like everything around me. So I am the same as the grass and the trees and the dogs and the zebras. I'm not greater than those things. I'm not less than those things, that I'm a part of those things.
Yeah.
And that is sort of where my spirituality comes from. I felt like I needed spirituality, but I couldn't go back to any kind of like angry mountain god.
Right.
I needed something that was gentler and more affirming for me.
Yeah.
And that's where I landed.
Yeah.
Within paganism, I felt like I found a little bit of structure for myself. So like, when it's time to harvest, I celebrate harvest. I get together with my friends. We're in Wisconsin, we celebrate the corn harvest. We get together, we celebrate when it's time for the wine harvest, maybe go out to the winery.
Well, that's kind of a fun one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just, we celebrate just the normal stuff of living.
Yeah.
And that's given me a little bit of structure in my life, which I appreciate. It's hard when you come from a really legalistic religion to go to nothing.
Right. No, I totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really hard. It's nice to have some kind of ritual in your life, or some kind of community, right, or both, right, or tradition that's really important.
Yeah. So that's where I landed.
Can you talk a little bit about your introduction to Christianity and what life was like growing up as a Christian for you?
What I always tell people is that my childhood was marinated in fear. My grandparents and mostly my mother's family were very involved in like Assemblies of God type churches. My mother eventually became involved with the United Pentecostal Church around 1978, so I was about 8 years old.
Okay.
And there was always this sense that hell was a very real place. And it wasn't just being cast into outer darkness. It was a real, literal, burning hell that would last forever. Yeah. And there was a lot of focus in my mother's family on end times theology. So my mother was kind of obsessed with the rapture and not missing the rapture. And so my whole childhood, for as far back as I can remember, I was constantly asking God for forgiveness, constantly aware that I could have sin in my life that might keep me out of heaven or keep me from making the rapture.
Wow.
So, religion really, I never met Jesus as grace or love.
Really?
God represented a scorekeeper. He represented someone who was always watching and waiting for me to do something wrong. And there was always a lot of talk in my church about, you have sins that you're aware of and sins that you're not aware of. So you need to be asking for forgiveness for sins that you're not aware of. So I spent my childhood really worried. Like, I sassed my mom. Does that mean that if the rapture happens, I'm going to miss it and be left here to fend for myself? So I dealt with fear of abandonment. I was really, I was exposed to like the Thief in the Night films, all of them.
Yep, me
repeatedly too. Every year, they'd cycle through the church. And because I was such a pious kid, I also attended campus ministry. So I'd watch them twice every time they came through.
Those were scary movies.
They were really scary. And they're actually a key component in why I have PTSD.
Wow.
Because when I got diagnosed with PTSD, I just started having flashbacks out of nowhere. And I had seen something online that was rapture related, and it just triggered this cascade of things inside of me that I didn't even realize were still there. And I had to seek help because I couldn't control it.
Wow.
It took over my day-to-day life.
And it just came out seemingly out of nowhere?
Yeah, I was online. I was watching a video about someone who was deconverting and was dealing with their fears about the rapture and the book of Revelations and all of that. And there just an image came up, and for whatever reason, it had this really profound effect on me. And I wasn't functioning. I couldn't move through my day.
Wow.
And so through therapy and through, working with a really good therapist, I came to realize that I had what she called complex PTSD, which is when there's a lot of contributing factors. And it was at that point that I really started to unravel that so much of my childhood was about fear. And, those movies are not meant for grade school kids. And the therapist
shown to
told
grade
me,
school kids.
Yes, they are.
I was a grade school kid when I saw it,
My therapist told me that, when you see them so young, sometimes your brain cannot differentiate between truth and reality.
Yeah.
And so those things, my brain experienced those things as truth.
Yeah.
And even though as a rational adult, I understand that I don't believe that anymore, sometimes that lizard brain doesn't. And so those things, will come forward. And even now, and I've done a lot of work on myself, but if it catches me in the wrong moment, I have to really psychologically fight it off.
I recently read someone who listens to the podcast, they had written that they had to stop listening to these stories and they had to start going to therapy. And, it makes me feel really bad on one hand because, no one wants to trigger someone.
Right.
And some of this is just inevitable and it's not anyone's fault other than maybe the religion and the people who were, cruel to the children or something.
Right.
But it's to me, it's just another point to make that just shows how incredibly traumatizing leaving Christianity is. It's just one more layer, Yes.
And for me, it's like, it's so much a part of my upbringing in the early years of my life. And it could be anything. I can hear a loud noise and my brain will immediately say, is that the trumpet? Even though rationally I don't believe that anymore. And then I have to talk myself down and I have to deal with the anxiety reaction. And I really believe firmly that it's child abuse.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people say that, and I think I agree. Like it because it's not children aren't prepared for that type of information. There's a reason we don't let children watch, horror movies when they're 3 or 4,
Exactly. And I can still occasionally have dreams of guillotines and, being chased. And so I will have these dreams. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not, but every so often it's like when my body needs a stress dream because I'm going through stress. Instead of being chased, by a bear, I'm being strapped into a guillotine, which is pretty traumatic.
Yeah. So you said that your childhood was marinated in fear, and it's because of just all of it, all the strict religion. Were your parents was their parenting style that way as well, or was it just the religion?
My parents really believed in corporal punishment. And so, spare the rod, spoil the child. And I think that my parents would say, if you were to ask them, they would say, she was a perfect child. Well, all right. I didn't get into trouble, but that's because I didn't want to get spanked with the belt. So, I don't know if I would have been as easy a child had I had different parents with different parenting styles.
Yeah.
So, I desperately wanted to know God and I desperately wanted to understand God. And I always tell people I was a very religious child.
Okay.
So from the moment I had my salvation experience, which happened at about age 10, I threw myself into service the way that most adults throw themselves into service. So I was doing Sunday school bus route. I was working at the nursing home. I was doing campus ministry. I was captain of my Bible quiz team.
As a young child?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I was the only kid my age doing any of these things. But hell was so real to me. And I felt like I have got to get out there and save some souls. Because if I don't, I'm going to be held to account for why I didn't tell people about Jesus.
Wow. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really
That's a
intense.
weird
And
kid.
was it, well, I don't think you're abnormal or atypical at all. I think there's a lot of Christian children that grew up like that. I mean, I've talked to so many people that have felt similarly when they were kids,
Right.
that they had to really, like, if hell's real, then I better go save everyone, and
Yeah.
so you said that you really wanted to know God, but you also said you never were exposed to the grace aspect of Jesus. Well, a lot of the Christians that I run into who are, they love the faith and stuff, they see Jesus as this peaceful figure, and grace is a good thing, and wanting to know God would mean being in personal relationship with him. How did your experience differ from that understanding?
Well, I mean, I was always asking him for forgiveness, and that pretty much was our relationship, right? I know that my righteousness is as filthy rags. I'm begging you to please forgive me because I really, really, really don't want to be left here.
Yeah.
Um,
Like you said, he's a scorekeeper. He's keeping
he's a
track of.
scorekeeper, and he's keeping track of my life, and so I got to make sure that balance sheet is where it needs to be. And so that was my relationship with him. And I did read a lot of the Bible. During the time that I was the Bible quiz captain, I memorized most of the New Testament and big parts of Proverbs and Psalms, because my coach at the time, because I was really good at memorization, wanted me to do all of my work, and then when I was done, circle around and do the chapters that belonged to other people,
Oh,
so
wow.
that we could win.
Oh, wow.
And
So you're doing like competitions with other churches?
yeah, the UPC still has this. United Pentecostal Church still has Bible quizzing. You have the little buzzer. It's King James. It's verbatim answers. And on the one hand, I should have been probably memorizing, I don't know, educational things. But on the other hand, I have a really good memory now
That's
because I
kind of
really
cool.
exercised it a lot when I was a kid. But
Yeah.
I memorized all this stuff, and then I started asking questions. And that was kind of where my self-esteem really started to take a hit, because I already felt like this horrible, rotten sinner. Even though I was saved, I was aware that I wasn't good, because only God is good, right?
Yeah.
But then I started to ask questions, and the reaction that I felt like I got from my Sunday school teachers, who were mostly male, my youth pastor, was, don't ask questions. Just listen to those who are in authority. Trust them. They know what's best for you. And when you get to heaven, you can ask Jesus anything that you want to ask him.
Wow. Yeah. A non-answer is the answer. They just don't.
Right.
They leave it a mystery. Yeah.
I was a really curious, kind of precocious kid, and I wanted to understand God. I wanted to understand, why is it this way? And I think part of the reason they didn't answer me is because they didn't know.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
But then it becomes like, a woman who asks questions is rebellious. Rebellion is the same as witchcraft. You're being a Jezebel. That was sort of the message that I was getting. The United Pentecostal Church is definitely a church that teaches women should be submissive. And they don't allow women to teach men, which I think is pretty common among a lot of similar churches.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be submissive to your husband and submissive to your pastor. And I think sometimes when you're a kid, you don't know where that ends. So I'm supposed to be submissive to my youth leader, and I'm supposed to be submissive to my pastor and to this elder over here. And I'm nothing but a lowly woman. Mm-hmm. And I think for some girls, that can really become a problem.
And I know, like, for you and your experience, that sounds like it played a really negative part in kind of the abuse that you experienced later.
It did. I think that there were a lot of things that happened because of my religious upbringing. The UPC that I grew up, the United Pentecostal Church I grew up in, we were very poor, and my family was poor, and my dad is from Mexico. There were some racist and classist issues at play. So I'm the poor little brown girl. And the message that my mother always got was, well, if you would just get your life right with Christ, your money problems would go away. There wasn't a lot of assistance from the church. So we had several summers where we didn't have electricity and we were like eating out of a cooler when it was just my mom and I. And the church, I mean, no one helped us. And one time a lady came up and gave my mother a check to pay the electric bill. But that's the only time that I can remember.
Yeah.
And so my mother always got the message that she wasn't good enough as well. Like, get your heart right with God and your money problems won't be a problem anymore. So it was a lot of judgment and not a lot of mercy or compassion, which, I think in the end, my feelings about God were really my feelings about the church. Yeah. But I superimposed one onto the other.
Yeah.
So the church was sort of judgmental and harsh and fear-based. And so that was the God that I knew.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
makes sense. I mean, that's the only way that you understand your religion is through the church,
Right.
Yeah.
And because it's the United Pentecostal Church is very insular. They don't really associate with other churches. They don't really associate with people outside the church. They kind of believe that they have the truth and no one else does. So you're better off just sticking to your people. The only reason you would really associate with someone outside the church was to witness to them.
Yeah.
So
it's just so cult-like, and I've said that. I swear, like the last 3 interviews that I've done, I've said that at some point, and it just really hits me that all these different denominations in Christianity, a good chunk of them become almost cult-like. It's our denomination's the only correct truth, and don't associate with outsiders. It's just crazy. It's so easy to slip into that.
Well, and I feel like, the United Pentecostal Church is even more so because they have such legalistic dress codes, and you're not really supposed to read things that aren't written by people from within the denomination. You should really focus on the Bible. You're not supposed to watch television. You're not supposed to, take in anything from the world. And then, the women all have to wear dresses. They can't wear makeup. They can't cut their hair. And I always have to stop with the hair cutting thing because people don't realize that not being able to cut your hair doesn't mean have long hair. It means never cut your hair. So if you can imagine what it would be like to be a woman with thick hair who's lived her whole life in that organization, your hair is dragging on the floor, which you can't do. So you're putting it all up on top of your head, and it's very heavy. And some of these women can have neck problems and back problems.
That's insane. I didn't realize that. They would go to that degree.
They take Paul's verse about not being shaven or shorn very literally.
So do the dudes grow their beards out as long as it... Okay, so...
Very clean shaven.
So the guys are fine, but the women have to grow their hair out.
And the men can kind of move about the world and look normal. But the women are really, I can spot them at 10 paces. I know exactly who they are when I see them out and about.
Wow.
And so, growing up, my mother had to take a job where she had to wear pants, but it was a really good opportunity for her because it was working for the city, which meant there were good benefits and good salary, and it would lift us out of poverty. But the church really turned on her because she took this job where pants were part of the requirement for the job.
So she took the job, and then how did that impact your family?
Well, we could eat, but the church really looked at it as, all of my mom's problems, because my mom did eventually die from chronic bronchial asthma. And she also struggled with depression her entire life. But they really looked at it as well, if you would just take those pants off, you wouldn't have to deal with all of this depression and sickness and whatnot. And it really just set up this, everything is your fault, whatever happens to you. And no one really extended compassion. It's a very judgmental type of place to be.
Yeah.
So when my abuser kind of comes into the story at that point, we don't have a lot to eat. My parents
You're vulnerable.
have just gone through a divorce, actually.
Okay. I was going to ask about that.
That was another thing that was another like slash in the no column for my mom.
Yeah.
They allowed the divorce because my dad committed adultery, but it was still not seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
So it was another marker that she didn't have her life in order.
Yeah. Wow.
So, here I am. I'm kind of this brown, poor child whose mother is kind of seen as not really being holy and living the holiness standards. And we didn't have electricity a lot of the time. And I think it made it very easy for my abuser to just kind of swoop in.
Yeah.
And
so at the time that this started, you were living with your mom, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's what you said. Yeah.
And for me, I took a lot of the blame for our poverty and I put it on myself because I believed if I had faith the size of a mustard seed, I could move mountains. And we didn't have food. So I turned that on myself and said, I don't even have faith the size of a mustard seed. What is wrong with me?
Yeah.
And why can't I move this mountain for my family?
Right.
And
internalize it.
Yeah, I internalized it and sort of blamed myself. And then I also thought, God sees the sparrow. He knows the number of hairs we have on the top of our head. Like, we're taught that he's got you, but he doesn't have me. So it really put me on the path of feeling like God's love was for everyone but me. Because I didn't understand. With my child's mind, I thought, I have faith. I'm saved. I'm doing everything the Bible says. And we still are just living on baloney.
Yeah, it's that whole, like, if you're doing it right, then your life will turn. It's almost like the prosperity gospel in a way. Like, if you're living a holy life, things will just start working out for you. And if you're doing something sinful, you're not wearing a dress, or your hair's not long enough, or you don't have enough faith, then things just turn on. And that's why your life's difficult. It's you.
Right. And actually, when my mother died in 1989, and at this point I had already left the church, and my stepfather, because my mother remarried, he was in rehab, but they let him out to come to the funeral. And someone from the church actually said to him in my presence, you need to get your life right with God, or you're going to end up like your wife did. That's insinuating crazy. That my mother was in hell at her funeral. It's just like, even nuts. At the point when you would be mourning, there's no compassion. I've only been back to that church once as an adult, and it was to attend a funeral of a classmate who took his own life. And it was the same thing. They made it into an object lesson. It was heartbreaking because I know so many people who have gotten involved in drugs or, other coping mechanisms because of the childhood that we shared. And this person was no different. He took his life. He had a lot of pain. But instead of showing compassion to him and his family and the people around him that loved him, it was all about, see, this is what will happen if you stray from the church. Yeah. Because they knew that all of us were going to be back for this funeral who were no longer involved in the church. And so I always say it was like a dog and pony show. It wasn't a funeral. Yeah. And it's just really sad. Yeah, it's horrible. So as far as your story goes, so then when your parents split, about how old were you? My parents split in 1980, so I was about 10. Okay, so you were about 10. That's when you accepted Jesus. That's kind of when your faith really became serious, maybe more serious, or... Yeah, I mean, up until that point, I was a kid, and I remember, I can remember my salvation experience really, really strongly. I was sitting in a pew towards the back of the church, and I was sitting on the aisle seat, and our pastor was kind of pacing back and forth and preaching about how your names are written on the gates of hell until Jesus takes them off. And I'm sitting there, and, my stomach is in knots, my chest is clenched, and I'm so scared. I'm both scared to get up and go to the altar, but I'm also scared to not.
Yeah.
And I remember, I always liken it to the scene in The Shining where the hallway gets really long.
Oh,
And
no.
I'm on the tricycle.
I haven't seen that movie. I know it's a famous movie, but
Yeah,
yeah.
well, you see that though oftentimes.
The hall
Yeah,
elongates and it's kind of creepy.
And in my mind's eye, that's kind of how it was. It was like this long walk down to the altar. And so in the United Pentecostal Church, salvation is in 3 parts. You have to repent. You have to be baptized in Jesus' name, which is what sets them apart from other Pentecostals because they don't baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And you have to speak in tongues. And if any one of those parts is missing, you're not saved.
Wow.
Which is really hard for a lot of kids because they would repent and they would get baptized, but they wouldn't speak in tongues, sometimes for weeks, for months. And that whole time their salvation is unsure.
That's so horrible. Like you said, it's child abuse. You're making these kids think they're going to burn in hell forever because they're not babbling in the right way.
Right, exactly. And so I'm down at the altar and these women just kind of descend on me and they're pushing me back and forth and they're wailing and crying. And I always tell people, I don't know. They said I spoke in tongues. I mean, I was crying, sobbing. And so who knows?
Yeah.
I wasn't speaking clearly.
Yeah. But you were given credit for it, apparently.
Yes, I was given credit. And I was baptized and that same night. And it's very much like, oh, you repented, you spoke in tongues. You have to get baptized right now. There's no waiting until the Sunday morning service or anything like that. Immediate, they take you up and do it. Wow. So, because they really believe, they believe that rapture might happen that night. And we need to take care of it now so that you're not in danger. So, if you can imagine being small and being in this big baptismal tank and the way that our church was set up, people could kind of be on all sides of it and they're singing and they're clapping their hands and they're speaking in tongues and they're waving their hands around. And the whole experience for me was just scary. It's just scary. There's just a lot of noise and people.
Yeah, it could for a kid for sure.
Yeah, it was a lot to take in, but I did feel relieved for a little while. I always tell people it lasted about 2 weeks. For about 2 weeks, I felt okay. I felt like Jesus and I were okay. I was saved. Everything was okay. But then, you hear over the pulpit, well, the story of the prodigal son who leaves the church and backslides and then dies in a car crash and doesn't go to heaven. So there's just these constant worries about the what ifs of the world.
Yeah, the relief ends, and then you're back to thinking about, well, yeah, but my salvation's not secure.
Right.
I could slide away, and all could be for nothing, and I could be lost. Yeah, so you're still fearful. That fear is always going to be there, that anxiety.
Well, and every sin is equal. So the sin of not respecting my parents and being sassy is the same as if I went out and shot someone.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, I became really kind of manic about constantly repenting.
Yeah.
Constantly being worried. Like, oh, I had a negative thought about this person, sitting next to me at this Bible study or whatever. I better take care of that right away because I don't want to be left.
Yeah. So you got baptized and they thought you spoke in tongues. So you're good, but then the relief only lasts for a few weeks.
Yeah.
And then, so what's the next stage in your story, or the next, like, how did your faith kind of develop from there, or what happened next?
Well, I became really involved because I really wanted to please God and I really wanted to help people be saved. Mm-hmm. And so I jumped into ministry, and I don't think the church really knew what to do with me because most of the kids didn't respond that way, but I took everything super seriously.
Yeah.
So I just kind of jumped into it. When I was 11, I also started attending the Christian school, which really meant that I was at the church 7 days a week.
Wow.
Because I was there Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Thursday night for church. I was there every day because our church school was in the basement of the church for school. And then I was there on Saturdays for like ministries and, youth group and Bible quiz practice and stuff. So I was really there more than I was at home.
Wow.
So my mom, at this point, she's starting to get sick. She's really feeling like she doesn't belong there, but she also really wanted me to always be there whenever the church doors were open. I think my mother really struggled because she felt like she didn't fit in, but she also felt like she didn't have a choice, which is what a lot of people feel. They feel like this church is the truth. I know this is the truth. So I have to stay even if I'm miserable and it's doing damage to me to be there.
Yeah.
And I see this a lot with people I grew up with who try to leave. They leave because they've been abused or something terrible has happened to them and they can't attend anymore, but they also can't go to church anywhere else.
Yeah.
Because they have it so ingrained in their mind that this is the truth. They always feel guilty. They always feel like they're in danger of hell. But there's no solution. It
really is like an abusive relationship, like between two people. Yeah. I mean, you have the religion or the church itself, and it's causing harm to the person, but the person feels they can't leave,
Right. And that's kind of why I think that the United Pentecostal Church is a cult, because I've seen the sort of the brainwashing that happens. It's like, I can't become an atheist. I can't pick a different church. I can only believe this, but I can't be here because I have this abusive history here. So I sit in this space of always feeling lost and backslidden and wrong, and they can't break free. And, I kind of just want to say to them, let me find you a good deprogrammer.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's sort of what they need.
Yeah.
Not everybody, has the same abilities. I'm really lucky. I was a curious kid, and when I decided to leave, I was able to work through it. But not everybody is successful with that.
So tell me about your curiosity and how that ended up being negative for your faith, but positive for you in the sense that you ended up getting out.
When I was in the church, it was negative because asking questions was negative. Being female wasn't great, and asking questions wasn't great. So me being this sort of free-thinking, precocious young woman didn't work out good for me. It really hurt my self-esteem. But when I decided that I was done with church in general, because after I left the UPC, I attended a Methodist church for a while. I attended a Southern Baptist church for a while. Mm-hmm. But when I decided I was done, I just started reading everything I could about the Bible, about Christianity and the history of it, because I've always loved history. Mm-hmm. And through reading that, I kind of came to the conclusion that I didn't believe any of it, that I thought it was all created by man.
How much time went by from that point, from when you were a kid till you ended up leaving the church?
So I left the UPC church around 16, 17. I had a year of high school left.
Okay.
When I had my kids in my early 20s, I felt compelled to go back to church. I felt like I needed to find a church. But I had the same problem that a lot of these other people I grew up with have, which is I went to the Methodist church and I'm like, this isn't the truth. I can't go here, but I can't go back to the UPC. So I went to a Southern Baptist church because it was the closest thing I could get to what I was raised in. Yeah. But even there, I always felt like, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
I could never feel completely comfortable.
Because Southern Baptists don't believe in tongues, right?
Nah, not the church that I went to.
Yeah, and, for the most part, I think generally speaking, of course, there's always exceptions, but generally speaking, that's what I've learned is that I don't think they believe in that. But they're very conservative, like Pentecostals are.
Yes, but I couldn't take them seriously because I'm like, well, your women wear pants to church. I mean, come on. And
where's the devotion here?
Exactly. And like I asked my pastor, I said, do I need to be rebaptized? And he was like, no, baptism is about obedience. You got baptized. Jesus understands you don't have to be rebaptized. And where that should have given me comfort, it didn't. It made me look at him and say, so what you're telling me is
you don't
take baptism seriously.
Yeah.
So it was hard. But eventually, well, during that time, I had a very abusive husband that I'm no longer with, and he was physically abusive and mentally abusive, and he had been arrested several times for it, and the church kind of said to me, "You can get a separation, but you can't get a divorce." And I said, "Well, the only way I can protect myself financially is if I get a divorce, and I need to file a restraining order, which is going to be really hard to do if I'm not willing to seriously separate from him."
Yeah.
And they said, "Well, if you divorce him, you will go to hell because he did not commit adultery."
And this is the Baptist church you were at?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And so I decided at that point I was angry because I had all of these years of struggling and trying so hard and feeling unaccepted by the church and by God. I just said, you know what? If I have to burn in hell in order to have a peaceful life and to keep my children safe, then I will pay that price. And so for a while, I was really angry. And but then once that anger kind of burned off, which was really only like maybe 3 months, my natural curiosity kicked in, and I thought, I want to understand this. I want to understand where the Bible came from, who wrote the Bible, where Christianity came from, how it started, because everything that I had learned was filtered through this United Pentecostal lens.
Mm-hmm.
And they really believe in the inerrant Word of God and the King James Version only.
Yeah.
So I really started to look at that. Where did the King James Version come from? Who wrote it? And it just kept giving me more questions and no answers. And so I just kept chasing down the questions until I got to an answer. And eventually I got to Genesis. And I found out that there are 2 creation stories in Genesis. And I thought, well, how can that be? Because this is the breath of God. One of these has to be right.
Yeah.
And then I started studying Eve and sort of how the church's viewpoint towards her changed over the years, how the church's viewpoint of Genesis changed over the years. And eventually it just all fell apart. And when Genesis fell apart, the whole Bible fell apart. Because if there's no original sin, then there's no need for a savior. If there's no original sin, there's no need to sacrifice a lamb every year. If there's no need for a savior, then what is the book of Revelations about? What is any of it about? And so for me, it just all fell apart when Genesis fell apart. It felt like laying down a bag of bricks.
Like leaving the faith felt like that?
Yeah, well, actually, not even leaving the faith. When Genesis fell apart, it was like I just laid down this bag of bricks.
Wow.
Because all of these feelings that I had about myself as a woman and feeling like women are weak and women are the reason that sin came into the world, and Eve is the reason why I have pain in childbirth, and all of these things, all of these negative things that I felt about myself for being female, it all just fell away. When I had this realization, at least for me, none of this is real.
Yeah, that must have been a really wonderful moment, because
it was.
It's a huge burden that's just lifted off your shoulders.
Of course, I was angry because I had been subjected to this.
There's
and
that,
It's taken me most of my adult life to unravel all of it. And I'm 49 years old, and I still have moments where I'm like, geez, I think this way, or I have this response because of what I learned in the church, and I didn't even recognize it.
Give me an example of that, if you don't mind.
Well, I really struggle with always feeling like I need to be in the background and not stepping out into the spotlight and taking credit for things. Well, because women are supposed to be shamefaced.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be submissive. We're not supposed to draw attention to ourselves.
Right.
And
so even if you feel like your place is to step forward, your place is to take the lead on something, one of your reactions is, nope, don't do it, stay small, just kind of like hide in the back.
Be the support person. which really comes from be the helpmate.
Yeah.
That's why Eve was created.
Adam's helper.
Eve wasn't created to stand on her own 2 feet and to have her own accomplishments. She was created to help her partner.
I kind of like this idea of like Eve is like this hero who despite God's rule, like sought out knowledge and truth anyway, mm-hmm. and like defied the God of the universe to like learn something. It's kind of a cool, like, you know, like and the villain's not really the villain here, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I was just like, who is this God? Like, okay, you're an all-knowing God. You know everything. You know what's going to happen in the future and what happened in the past, and you know all my thoughts. Why'd you put that tree in the garden?
Right. Like, what are you trying to do here?
Like, this is your creation. They don't know anything. Like, why? And then why would you allow the snake to have access to this creation?
Exactly.
If you know what's going to happen. Yeah, and so, like, I started to think about it more and more, and I'm like, who is this God? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And to me, if I knew that all of this bloodshed and pain and whatnot was going to be the future for my creation, I wouldn't create them.
It just seems like cruel to do that type of thing.
Right. And so for me, like, I grew up as a kid who really cared about logic, and it just stopped making sense to me. I couldn't
reconcile it.
I could no longer pretend that I believed this.
Now that you'd learned what you'd learned, you couldn't go back. There's no unlearning
and
that.
Also, I started to like really get interested in science, and all the science that I had growing up in the Christian school was filtered through the church's lens. And so once I really started to dig into science, I was like, okay, there's no way. And again, going back to Genesis, this is not real. This is, and if it's just, and then people come forward and say, well, it's a metaphor. Okay, so is sin real? And then again, we go back to, why do we need a savior if this is a metaphor?
Right. If it's just like representative of something, then.
Well, and also like going back to the grace thing, like I wasn't introduced to Jesus, I think the same way that other people were, because the church that I grew up in really taught about like, I don't come to bring peace, but a sword. You have to separate yourself from your family. Well, of course, that's what they wanted. They don't want you to have any influence but the church. And so they would use those verses. They would use the verses that sort of made Jesus seem to be less about grace and compassion. And so that was the Jesus that I met. Yeah. And all of these other churches are soft and they're leading you astray. And this is the devil's trick to think that Jesus is all love and light. Really, he's not. And, here are these examples. And so, that's how I internalized it.
So at what point did you stop believing in what you called the angry mountain god? I think that's what you'd said.
Early 20s, my early 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, there's this relief, and then there's also this just like, why was I fooled for so long? I'm so angry at the influence this church had.
Well, and I was just angry at like the pain and suffering that I went through as a child, the mental torture, the emotional torture. And once I got out, which is really common in like abuse situations and any kind of traumatic situation, once I got out was when my body started to respond. That's when I started to have anxiety attacks. That's when I started to have like all of these physical responses to the trauma that I had just had inflicted on me. And so then it took me forever to connect the dots between what's causing this anxiety, where does it come from, why do I suddenly have it, to figuring out that it was all related to the church and the way that I was raised.
Wow. It's almost like it opened up kind of a floodgate.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that your body wasn't responding fully in that way when you were going through it. It's almost as if you were able to block some of it out, at least. Some of that response.
I think that I was. I think that I was the type of kid where, because we were poor and we didn't have food and my parents were always in some kind of struggle, I was really a push it down and move on. Put on a brave face, do what you have to do type of kid. And so I did that for a really long time until my body couldn't do it anymore.
It made me think of this is a really simplistic analogy, but like crying, like when you're going through really horrible emotional experience, oftentimes, at least for me, like I know I don't cry in the moment, like I'm engaged and it's intense,
right,
and it's
right.
And then maybe later as things calm down, then it's like it all comes out,
Well, I think that when your body is afraid or it's experiencing trauma, like I was saying, my childhood was like all about fear. It's on high alert.
Yeah,
and
it's like survival mode.
It's about keeping you safe. But then once you're safe, then your body starts experiencing all of the trauma. And so I had to figure that out. So I always tell people whenever I talk about trauma, because I feel like it's really important to read The Body Keeps the Score. Because that book really helped me a lot to process my trauma. And actually, I have it right here.
Oh, cool.
It's a really fantastic book. He starts out talking about Vietnam vets and then sort of talks about how PTSD...
What's the last name? It's Bessel van der...
Kolk. Kolkmd.
MD. Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. I might check that out.
He starts out talking about like PTSD victims that, were in the military. And then he starts talking about how they started to see abuse victims that were showing the same symptoms and the same syndromes. And what I've discovered from working with survivors of like the type of Christianity that I grew up in, we all have the same symptoms. We all have anxiety. We're all hypervigilant. We all have sleep disturbances. Some of us have eating disorders. All of these things that you would associate with PTSD also show up in religious trauma survivors.
Wow. Yeah. It's just, I don't think any Christian I ever talked to ever knew even about the kind of trauma people go through in leaving the faith. Even people who grew up in a really healthy, quote unquote healthy church and great family environment, they still, I would sort of put myself in that boat. Like I felt like my church was fairly okay. Obviously, there's things, but even when you come from, it's still traumatic and it's still really hard to process.
Right.
Yeah. It has real life implications on your health.
Even if you grew up in a healthy church, you're still being brought up to believe that you're a sinner.
Right. So is it really healthy?
Yeah. You're born with this sin virus, right? That no matter what you do, you couldn't be good. So I don't know. I have to question how healthy that is for anyone.
No, that's a very good point. And you were talking about baggage that you carry with you. I do think some of my ideas of the church being a positive place, they kind of linger in there. Yeah.
But
I think no matter how much you smile and say it's nice, if you're telling a child or a person even that inherently at your core, you're bad. Inherently at your core, you deserve eternal torment. That's not ever good. Even if you welcome them into your community and you sing nice songs and
Well, and some of it depends on the child too, right? Like not all the kids I grew up with took things as seriously as I did.
Yeah.
So I was a really serious kid and I was a very sensitive kid and I took it all to heart. And so it had a huge impact on me, whereas other kids, not as much. Well, and I'm that way with everything, right? So if there's something I'm interested in, I jump in and I want to know everything about it. That's just my personality. And so I think that different personalities are more impacted and it's more dangerous for different personalities.
True.
Depending on who you are.
I think that's a very important point that's come up before, and I think that's so important because there are certain people who I think, maybe we fit into that boat. I feel like I do. You take it so seriously, you're so engaged in it, it becomes incredibly harmful when you leave.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, because you're losing everything. I see this with the women in my survivor group that some of them they lose their family. When you leave, you lose your whole community. We were not very well educated, especially as females. So we got kind of a subpar Christian education. They use ACE. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. If you get a chance, go online and look up Accelerated Christian Education and look up what the classrooms look like. Because
Okay.
we sat in basically a little cubicle with slats on both sides.
Oh, I think Wendy Marsman, who I had on early in the podcast, I think she went through that where there was like, you weren't even able to look at the neighbor next to you.
Yeah, and so it was a really
Wow.
isolating, lonely experience for me as a kid. I'm a kinesthetic learner, so like having to just sit and like stare at a piece of paper all day was torture for me.
Torture, yeah.
But they taught us that the Loch Ness Monster was real, and everything is filtered through this uber right-wing fundamentalist
Weird
view. And so I think when we were going back to like my mom not really feeling welcome, but still really feeling like I needed to be at church whenever I could.
Yeah.
And I think she was really proud of the fact that I was being so successful.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I would get rides from other adults in the congregation to, events or church or whatever, and rides home. And sometimes we would go out to eat after church and have a meal. Pentecostals, I think, and United Pentecostals in particular, they really like to eat. And I think it's because they can't do anything else. They can't watch TV.
Oh, that's funny.
They don't even, like, they don't go to sporting events because you should be praising Jesus and not clapping for your team. So, like, eating is kind of like a sport to them. So we would go out and have a meal and whatnot. And so one day I was standing in a group of adults like I often did. And I said, can anyone give me a ride home? And this guy who had recently joined the church said, sure, I can give you a ride home. Well, I didn't know him. I saw him around. I knew that he had recently gotten married there. Him and his wife, were new members. But I mean, my mom kind of always believed if someone was in the church, they were safe. Because they were in the church.
Yeah.
And none of the other adults around me seemed to think that it was odd. They kind of introduced me to him and said, oh, yeah, he lives between your house and the church, so it would be super convenient for him to give you a ride. And so I went with him. And I have to sort of, say, one of the characteristics of the church that I grew up in is that there's not a huge line between kids and adults. So it's not uncommon to have a youth group that is like 12 to 35. So,
there's a mixing of really different ages.
There's a mixing of really different ages, and I think that's a problem, right? So I went with him. He asked me if I needed to be home right away, and I said no, because at this point my mother was working a lot and I was home alone a lot. And he said, well, how about I take you for ice cream? And I was like, sure, because I mean, at this point we had no money. We didn't really have a lot of food in the house.
What kid's going to say no to that?
Right. And so at this point I'm 11, he's 29. And so he takes me for ice cream and everything is fine. But then at one point he sort of reaches down and just holds my hand. And I can remember that moment like it was yesterday, because I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, this is weird. But my dad holds my hand when he takes me to the park. Yeah. So maybe he's just trying to be like my dad.
Friendly, comforting.
Just, he's a godly man. So it's okay. And that just sort of escalated, and it lasted for about 2 years. He was very charismatic. He was very popular. He played the trumpet in our church band every Sunday, so he was always on stage. When I went to Bible camp, he was there. He was very popular. He would play at Bible camp, play his trumpet. And it's really interesting because at the time, he couldn't be an elder because he had been married before. Because they take very seriously husband of one wife.
Oh.
So because the woman he married when he joined the church was his second marriage, he couldn't be an elder, he couldn't be a minister.
Oh, okay. So if you were married once, you were fine. If you were
Right.
married at the time, you could be an elder, just not if you'd married a second time.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so, um, he couldn't be an elder, but he kind of hung out with all of the ministers and the elders, and, that was his social. So I'm seeing him as an 11-year-old sort of being this godly man who's surrounded by all of these men that I respect. And he starts telling me how lonely he is, how awful his marriage is, how
And you're 11 when he's talking to you like this. This is nuts.
And
yeah.
how his wife isn't having sex with him. She would fast and she wouldn't have sex with him when she was fasting, and how he was having a really big struggle dealing with that. And unfortunately, I was kind of the perfect child to tell that story to, because my mother always overshared her problems. And I was really her caretaker. I was really her support person. And I knew way too much about her life. And so when this other adult comes along and is in need and is suffering and is lonely, and, and it's funny because at one point
you're slipping right into the role of support person. You're comfortable with this. So you weren't uneasy hearing these stories or these things he was telling you?
And it was funny because at 11 years old, this just kind of shows how precocious I was. I said, "Oh, it really sounds like you need to counsel with a pastor. You should go talk to the pastor about this. Maybe he can talk to your wife. Maybe you guys can get some counseling." And, I don't think that's what he wanted, right?
Oh,
clearly. He wanted to have sex with me ultimately. But, so, he eventually, very shortly after the hand-holding incident, he told me he wanted a kiss. And I thought, well, this is weird.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever, weirdo, So I kissed him on the nose and just kind of laughed. And I was like, "You're weird, whatever." And he's like, "No, that's not the kind of kiss I want." And it kind of just snowballed from there. Finally, the last interaction I had with him, he actually tried to have intercourse with me.
Wow.
I was 12, 13. And he wasn't able to, thankfully. I think that scared me in a way that the other interactions hadn't scared me. Wow. I was scared the whole time, but this was the level.
This is next level.
This is next level. And even at that point where he's trying to have intercourse with me, I still don't know what he's doing, because I was raised in this really insular environment where we didn't have sex ed. You don't talk about sex. You're not supposed to think about sex. You're not supposed to ask questions about sex. So even though I kind of knew technically how sex worked, I really wasn't aware of what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
And at that point, I had gotten to the point where I was very heavily dissociating. So I felt like I would sort of leave my body and go to the corner of the room while all of this is happening.
You're checking out, so to speak.
Checking out.
Yeah.
And then kind of come back when it was over. Wow. And it was really hard because I felt responsible, because we were really taught that men fall into sin, women cause men to fall into sin. So there had to have been something that I was doing or something that I was saying, which is so funny because I was 11 and I was covered from head to toe, in this very legalistic holiness standard clothing. And so, I just took it all on myself. I would go home and I would cry and pray and cry and pray and ask God to forgive me and to ask him to help my abuser to be strong and to not do this anymore.
Yeah. And
it was hard because on the one hand, he was doing these things to me that I didn't understand and that I was uncomfortable with, and that I kind of instinctively knew it was sin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But at the same time, he was feeding me. So, he would take me and he would get me lunch.
That's
and
what's
he
so
would
evil about this to me is you needed basic things 3 square meals,
or even just a parent who was around.
Yeah.
Worked all the time.
He was
and
using that to his advantage.
He was. And so, he would feed me. He talked to me like I was an adult, which made me feel important. He listened to my concerns. But then at the same time, he would say to me, this is really evil, what we're doing. We need to stop doing this. This is a sin. And I would see him at the altar sort of praying and speaking in tongues. And, he would say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then he would go right back to it again.
Yeah.
It was like a compulsion.
Yeah.
And so eventually, so I worked at the church's popcorn wagon. So we had this little popcorn wagon that they would take downtown, and we would sell popcorn and soda and like fruit. Because I live in the capital city, we have a lot of politicians and it's a very busy area. And so I was working with a 19-year-old who was sort of supervising, and I was working with her, and I just blurted it out one day. And I had not told a single solitary soul.
Okay, how old were you?
I was
still
12, 13.
Okay, still around that age. You're working at the popcorn wagon, and it just came out.
Yeah, I was like, well, this is happening.
Like middle of the day.
Yeah, it was just like, and to her credit, she just asked me questions.
Oh, wow.
She was like, so what exactly do you mean? So what exactly happened? And
was it just you? Sorry for all the questions, but was it just you and her, like, at the popcorn stand at that moment?
Yeah.
Okay, so you must have felt like you could just tell her, like, she was a trustworthy person or something. Or...
I don't know. I think that when he actually tried to have intercourse with me, it scared me.
Yeah.
And I think that it just kind of came out. Like, I think I just couldn't hold this secret in anymore.
Wow. And so here's this, like, wonderful woman who's very calmly just kind of walking you through this.
Which is so weird because most of the people in the church wouldn't have been that way. So I got really lucky.
Okay. And she was a churchgoer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So she went home, and she was living with a minister and his wife who attended our church, who they were very involved with the campus ministry. She told them what I said, and they basically told her, you need to tell her. If she doesn't tell the pastor, we're going to tell the pastor. So I had to make an appointment with my pastor, who I was afraid of.
Yeah.
And
by yourself.
By myself. I didn't tell a parent, and basically tell him all of these intimate secrets of all the things that have been happening to me. So, my pastor was a big man. He was also the superintendent of our entire state, district superintendent. Wow. So he had a lot of power within the organization. And to me, he was just this loud, angry guy who was always talking about hell and sin. And he had this enormous desk. And actually, if you talk to anyone from my survivor group, we all talk about this ridiculous desk that this guy had. It was compensating for something.
Oh, yeah, something. Yeah, it's a power move, I guess.
This little kid sitting across from him, and he's asking me questions, and I'm, saying yes, no, whatever. And then he said, okay. And I left the office, and he never said a word to me about it after that. So I went home. A couple days later, I got a call from my abuser, and he said, I'm leaving town. It's not your fault. And that was it. And then a couple days after that, I went to our midweek service. And what I was told was that he had been caught in bed with his wife's little sister. And that's why he left town, not because of me. Because her parents weren't in the church, so they couldn't be controlled.
This gets to, and I know we'll get to it later, but the bill that you're trying to help, the mandated reporting piece, like that would have been huge right there. If that person had to report what was going on, then the right steps would have been taken. But yeah. Right.
So the story goes that while, so I was friends with his wife, and while he was abusing me, the two of them introduced me to her younger sisters, and we kind of became friends. They didn't live in Madison, and I would be pen pals with them. We would write each other notes and send stickers back and forth because we were kids. Yeah. And eventually, his wife's youngest sister moved to Madison and moved in with them and started to attend the same school that I went to.
And she was around your age?
She's about 3.5 years older than me. So I I thought, this is great. My friend is moving here. I'm going to have a new friend to hang out with. But as soon as she moved to Madison, she got really, really distant.
Oh.
Wouldn't talk to me. Was really acting strange. And, it all made sense afterwards, because what I was told was he was basically sleeping with her while he was abusing me. And I mean, that explains a lot to me. But he's married to her now and pastoring a church here in Wisconsin.
That's insane.
So he was sent away for restoration, and eventually started pastoring a daughter work, which is what they call when they're planting a church. It's like a daughter work up in the Neenah area, which is north of us. And it's all on record with the UPC that he was there. So it's weird that they wouldn't let him be an elder when he was in the Madison church, but when after he had, basically done these horrible things, they allowed him to pastor a daughter work with my pastor at the time being the superintendent and knowing everything that had happened in his own church. And so eventually he went independent. He basically believes exactly the same, teaches exactly the same things as the United Pentecostal Church. He just is independent. And I think that, I suspect that that's in part because if he's independent, no one can remove him from his position.
Yeah, that's probably true. There's no oversight there. But even with the oversight, it didn't seem to help all that much.
No,
and what should be happening is these people should be prevented from ever serving in a church ever again.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And I think that, I've always believed that he is a little bit like he has some kind of personality disorder, because he is super charisma. He has super charisma. And the UPC, they don't associate with people that aren't UPC, but they all associate with him. They're friends with him on Facebook. United Pentecostal ministers come and preach at his church, which is against the rules of the United Pentecostal Church. You can only preach at another UPC church. So for some reason, he is given special privileges that other people aren't given. And I've never been able to figure out why that is. But at the end of the day, I told my pastor, because he was the highest authority that I knew. I didn't have interactions with police officers or school teachers that weren't in the church.
Right.
And everybody who was in the church, including my parents, were under my pastor. So they really believe, touch not the Lord's anointed. You're not supposed to question the pastor. Whatever the pastor's decisions are right and godly, because God put him in that position.
Yeah.
So when I would talk to people about this and say, okay, he didn't get me any help. He didn't get me any support or therapy, or even really go to my parents and tell them what he knew. What I get back from people is, well, it's not for us to question. He's God's anointed. He knows better than we do. God knows better. And kind of this very Pollyanna, God's going to judge everyone in the end. You can just let this go.
Yeah.
But I can't let it go, because I know what he did to me, and I know what he did to his wife, and I don't believe that pedophiles stop. I mean, scientifically, we know that they don't stop. We have statistics and lots of evidence that show that they don't stop. So I don't believe for a minute that I'm the only one.
Yeah. Is that what has motivated you to take action? And when did that start? Like because you told him when you were a child, and then all these years later now, something kind of motivated you to jump into action.
So it's a bunch of things. I grew up pretty much at the age of 12 or 13 being branded the church slut. They did not show compassion for me. It was like, she's a loose child. And I kind of had, and the thing that was hard is, so
you were
my
seen as obedient, and you were such a good little Christian girl growing up to that point. It's weird that they would change.
Women cause men to fall into sin.
Yeah.
Men fall into sin.
Yeah.
So I was sort of seen as this.
You'd fallen.
This fallen woman
Yeah.
at 13.
Yeah.
And And it was really hard because he left and the other girl he abused left. And I was the living reminder of that occurrence.
Yeah.
And I had to sort of bear that.
And so other people in the church knew about it. The pastor must have told the elders or something.
Well, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
a grown man who's as popular and as integrated into the congregation as he was, who's on stage playing the trumpet every Sunday, doesn't just leave a church and nobody know.
Yeah.
A teenage girl who is attending a school that only has like 50 kids in it doesn't just disappear and nobody knows.
Right.
So, and he's got a wife who's there who is suffering and struggling, who, by the way, at the next service I attended, took me down into the basement to pray for my salvation. She told me that
his wife at the time.
Yeah, she was very disappointed in me that she had trusted me with her husband. And that, I needed to pray that God would forgive me with her. And so that was really traumatic. It really drove home the message that it was my fault, that I had done something, terrible. And it's weird because, so at the time he sold church pictorial directories for Olin Mills. And so he would travel around and he would visit with churches and try to sell them on getting these directories. And he worked out a deal with my parents where he could take me with him on his day trips. Mm. So we would go, 4 hours away and we would be gone all day. And he had really easy access to me. But the argument was always, well, you have no electricity. There's nothing for her to do. She's really lonely. I'm on this long car trip. I can be like a dad figure to her and spend time with her, which is not at all what his motivation was.
Not at all. Yeah.
But that was another way he manipulated my family into believing that he was, being like a healthy role model or a father figure.
Yeah. So you were able to get through the years after he left. You were able to stay in that church for a period of time for a while.
I left 16, 17 years old. It was right before my last year of high school. And I was just heartbroken. I got to the end of my rope and I couldn't do it anymore. And,
was it the judgment and feeling like just all of that? It
was all of that. It was like getting to a dating age and realizing that a lot of people didn't want me to date their son because of what Steve had done to me, or they didn't want me to date their son because I was half Mexican. I mean, we could fill up a month worth of podcasts with me telling you stories about my childhood. That's but like, nuts. I was carrying so much pain, and I finally just said, I can't do this anymore.
And so you left that church, but then that's when you started looking for you didn't start looking for a church till you had kids later.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you kind of stayed away from the church for a while?
I did because I didn't feel like I could go anywhere else, but I didn't feel like I could go there. Yeah. But then when I had kids, I was like, okay, I have to do something because I'm responsible for their religious education. I'm responsible for their relationship with Christ. And so then I started to look for other options.
Yeah. Wow. And did you open up to anyone else about what had happened to you from that point until recently?
I've been telling people my whole life. I've been telling people this story my whole life. And what I hear from people is, have always heard up until now is, well, you're not in that situation anymore. So aren't you glad? And, you can just get on with your life and let go of this and forgive this and whatnot. And in my head, I'm thinking, right, but he's still here and he's pastoring a church. And how do I just let that go? And even now, since I've been telling my story, I've come up against people from the church who say a couple of different things to me. One is, you should forgive him. And if you would just truly forgive him, God would heal you and you wouldn't have this trauma anymore. I've also heard that pedophilia is not in the Bible. And therefore, what happened to you wasn't pedophilia, it's adultery. And some part of you must have wanted that sin, must have attracted that sin to yourself. Which is like a really horrible thing to say about a child.
Right? Yeah. It's ridiculous.
That's what I've contended with is that I'm bitter, that I just need to let go and forgive.
But
And
the
so,
thing, yeah, you don't have to forgive. Like, you're not
right.
Christian anymore.
And that's what I keep telling people. I'm like, what? It's like, I believe that forgiveness is kind of a Christian construct.
Yeah.
And it's just something that I don't feel like I have to do unless I want to.
Sure. I mean, like in some circumstances, not this one.
Right, right.
Like, sure, if people, but that's up to the person who was harmed. They get to decide.
And because he's never taken any responsibility for it, I don't feel like I should forgive him.
Right. He's a danger still.
Right. Exactly. So I've been telling people this my whole life. And I have a friend who I met through some of my activism work, and she contacted me one day and said, Debbie, these people on Twitter, they're talking about something really similar to what happened to you, and I really think you need to get over there. And so at the time, the Me Too movement had just happened, and the Church Too movement was just starting. Are you aware of what?
No, I was going to ask, but I didn't want to interrupt. So the Church Too movement. So yeah, tell me about what that is.
Oh my, that is a whole rabbit hole. So the Church Too movement was basically when a bunch of people started to get online and talk about their church experiences of being abused as children in the church, and how, this abuse doesn't just happen in the workplace. It doesn't just happen, out in the world. It happens in churches. It happens in synagogues. It happens everywhere. And so I'm reading these stories and I'm just like emotionally breaking down, just like all of this stuff is coming out of me. And the one thing I noticed is I didn't see anyone that was United Pentecostal at all that had grown up that way. And so as I'm reading these stories and spending hours and hours and hours combing through these stories, I decided I have to tell my story. Because what if even if there's just one person who reads my story and feels less alone, less isolated, more worthy, then it's worth it. And I decided if I'm going to tell my story, I'm going to tell it all. I'm going to name names. I'm going to give locations. I'm just going scorched earth on this.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did.
I like it.
And that was in December of 2017. And so I was contacted by a woman who runs a group called spiritualabuse.org. They have a very active Facebook page. I highly recommend it to anyone who's leaving, especially Pentecostalism, as a resource. And she said, I read your blog. I think it's amazing. And there are a bunch of girls in this support group that I'm a part of that are talking about you and your abuser. They say they know you.
Whoa.
Do you want me to add you to this group? And I said, sure. And what I found out, much to my dismay, is that I wasn't the only one. Because I thought my whole life I was the only one.
Yeah.
So, it's terrible this happened to me, but I'm the only one. And I find that these girls that I babysat for when I was a teenager were all abused by men in the same church.
Wow. So not just this one guy.
No, and that's what makes the situation really unique, is that it's so systemic. This idea that it's okay for 30-year-old men to date 14-year-old girls. And it's not just one man, it's 20 men.
There were 20 men in that church that did that?
I'm sure. I'm sure there's probably more than that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've become a container for stories because I have so many survivors that have come to me with their stories, but they're too afraid to talk publicly. And so I am sort of this container for all of this stuff. But because I got in contact with these girls and I felt I was angry, I was sad, I was frustrated, and I didn't know what to do because in my mind's eye, I'm still seeing them as little girls, even though they're grown women, right? So we started this really small support group on Facebook of about 8 of us. And we started to build trust with each other. We started to tell each other stories, but we also started to try to piece together stories that we all heard pieces of, in hopes that maybe we could go get some of these other survivors. and bring them into our group. And so through that, we eventually opened it up to more people, and we have about 25 people in that group now. We would have more, except that we have pretty strict rules about who can be in the group. So you have to be completely out of the UPC, just for our own safety. You can't still be attending services sometimes.
Yeah.
I will talk to people that are trying to work their way out, but I have to be really protective of the people that are in this group that are sharing their stories, because a lot of them still have family there. They still have connections there,
right.
And
could cause some serious problems.
Yeah. So I started this group, and we were looking for an investigative reporter. We were looking for someone to tell our story. Meanwhile, I'm writing my story on my blog, all of it, not just about the abuse, but pretty much everything. And I decided to write an open letter to the current pastor of that church. The current pastor is the pastor who I grew up with. It's his son. The pastor Pastor Grant, who was my pastor, created a bishop position for himself that hadn't existed previously. So he became the bishop. His son became the pastor, and I think his grandson is the youth pastor.
Okay, so it's a family ordeal here.
I really kind of consider it to be a crime family, because there's just so much abuse that's been covered up. I have had survivors come to me and tell me that they were told not to go to the police, that their parents were told not to go to the police. There's really an attitude of it should be handled within the church. Paul tells us we're not supposed to sue one another. So we don't want to bring shame on the church. One of the survivors talks about how she was told, if you bring shame on the church, people won't come to church here. They won't get saved. They'll go to hell, and that will be your fault.
People are so twisted.
So they're very, very invested in covering this up. So eventually, I decided to write this open letter, and I thought, I'm going to write from a place of compassion. And I'm going to talk about how this church raised me, the happy memories that I did have, and try to come at them from a place of understanding and saying, it would really take a load off of my heart and the heart of the other survivors if you would put systems in place to deal with these things the way that they should be dealt with. Yeah. If you would take some responsibility and come to the table with survivors, that we could create an environment of healing. Well, they weren't interested in that, to say the least. And so more survivors started to say, can I write an open letter, expressing my feelings? So we posted a few of those. Another survivor told her story on the blog, and we still really weren't getting any kind of anything from them. And so I was aware that an assemblywoman who I sort of had a working relationship with, because I do a lot of activist work, was working on some bills to end the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse victims, but also to close the clergy loophole. So in Wisconsin, if you're a pastor or a priest, you do not have to report if you hear of abuse.
That's so crazy. How was that? Was that written into the law, that specific piece?
It was written into the law, and it was supposed to be strictly for the confessional, but it has been stretched and applied across the board. So I think that's terrible. Yeah. And they've been trying to work on this statute of limitations part of the bill for a decade or more, and haven't been able to get it passed, mostly due to Republicans, people that are on the right wing that support churches. And really, I believe it's all about money. The churches have seen what is happening to the Catholic Church. They know there's going to be lawsuits. They don't want this bill to pass because people are going to be wanting, they're going to be taking them to court, and they don't want to suffer. And
So ironic.
It is. It is. It's crazy. And
They don't want to suffer, yeah.
because we knew that we weren't really going to get a lot of support from the right wing, what they decided was we're just going to ask for everything we want. Instead of trying to meet them halfway, we're going to ask for everything we want. And one thing we want is the end to this clergy loophole. They are members of the community. They are seen as sort of community authorities, and they should be responsible, just like doctors and nurses and teachers and social workers, to report when a child comes to them and says someone is hurting me.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just go for sexual, that also goes for physical. If the child's being beat in the home, the pastor should report that to the police. And I don't understand why this is even a question. It shouldn't. Protecting children shouldn't be a partisan issue. It really shouldn't. But here in Wisconsin, it's very difficult to get any Republican support for this because they are so enmeshed with the churches, and the churches are against it. The Catholic Church came out within 24 hours of this bill being announced, came out against it because it violates the sanctity of the confessional.
And there's a lot of people out there who do believe that, these types of things, the sin is something that's, kind of between a pastor and the congregation and the person who's, and that's a confidential, almost like a lawyer or something. Like you can tell them anything, the lawyer,
right,
won't tell kind of thing or something.
But my attitude is we live in a secular society, and therefore, so what you're telling me is if my child is molested in the classroom, that should be handled by the police. But if they're molested in their Sunday school class, then somehow that criminal gets a pass. And so I believe that no matter who commits the crime, no matter where the crime is committed, and no matter who finds out about it first, which is oftentimes clergy, it should be reported. And it's still a crime. And it should be the same as any other situation. So we went to talk to our assemblywoman, who I knew was working on these bills. Her name is Chris Taylor. And she's actually not my assembly person, but my assembly person was also present because I invited her. And I took a group of survivors, and we just sort of exposed this church to them. And we said, we're coming here to raise awareness. We know that most of us are beyond the statute of limitations, but we think you should know that this is happening in your community. And we believe it's still happening. Why wouldn't it be still happening? The same people are in power. The same men that have abused other girls are still there. They're still preaching. Why would we think that it was different? And they were super supportive. And it was really great for these survivors who, a lot of them, a fear of government is built into this church. So, one world government, don't let the government know your business, that. Right. So this was a really positive experience for them, getting to go talk to elected officials who cared, who listened, who were sympathetic, who wanted to hear their stories. And the assembly person put me in touch with Caitlin Farrell, who is a writer for the Cap Times, one of our local newspapers. And she actually ended up doing a story about us. And so, much to my shock and horror, I was on a front page of our local newspaper.
I think you sent me the link, and I was looking at the Cap Times. I'm on that site right now. Actually, I was looking at before we jumped on.
Yeah, so it was the whole front of the paper.
You're like, there I am.
And, I really felt like, again, kind of scorched earth. Like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. And so, 4 of us were willing to talk and give our names, and then a whole bunch of other people talked to her anonymously because a lot of people are afraid of the church. They're afraid of the pastor. They're afraid of what might happen. They weren't this way when I was a kid, but now they've kind of become gun nuts. They're very the ushers conceal carry because you never know when the church is going to get shot up or whatever. And apparently the conceal carry thing started when my blog came out. So they thought that I was such a threat, I guess, that they all needed to be armed, which I don't understand. But
silly. Yeah.
So the assemblywoman suggested that we go talk to our chief of police. And so we did. And that was also very empowering. I took a group of victims in. I also took a pastor who had left. He's still a Christian, but he is no longer UPC, and he has come out in support of us. And so he came,
Oh,
which
cool.
really was nice for the survivors to have him there.
Yeah.
And we went and we
Sweet.
told our story to the chief of police. Some of us filed police reports. I filed a police report about a year ago, which was really empowering to me, even though I knew that they couldn't do much for me, just having it there.
On record.
And also because I feel like if a new victim comes forward, there's a foundation that's been laid that this is a problem.
And they can learn from what you've put in that report.
Exactly.
They can, and if something were to happen down the road, that could be used as evidence, or
right.
Or maybe it could just be used, like you said, as a foundation or something. So that's helpful.
So we made our reports. We talked to the police chief. He was very sympathetic. He spent a very long time talking to us. We spoke to him about sort of the culture of the church where you don't involve the police, where people are told not to tell the police. The church actually had a police officer who attended there, who would show up in uniform when people were talking to the pastor about abuse and would lead parents to believe he was filing a report, but then the reports were never made.
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, that's the level of deception and harm that was done.
Yeah, that's insane.
That didn't
I can't even wrap my head around that.
But it is documented in the newspaper article. And so, we talked to him. He was very sympathetic. He told us to please tell, if any new survivors come forward, to please ask them to come fill out a report. Don't worry about if the statute of limitations is passed. We need to know these things irregardless.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, that was great. So, these assemblywomen and a couple of our state Senate people decided that they wanted to introduce this bill, that it was ready. And so they asked me to speak, which was terrifying. I sent you the link to the press conference too.
Yeah.
I've never done anything like that before. I'm pretty politically active, but I don't consider myself a public speaker. But I was able to, along with another survivor from the same church, tell our stories at this press conference and really talk about why closing the clergy loophole is so important and why it's important to not have the statute of limitations, because the reality is most survivors of this kind of abuse don't really come to terms with it until they're in their 40s. Because you leave the church and you're deconverting and you're dealing with all of that deconverting, and then you start a family or you're getting started in your career and you're coping with that, and all of a sudden you've got the space and the time to deal with what happened to you. It took me until last year to even be able to sort of admit to myself that I was raped. And it's funny because I'm a feminist and I work for women's causes, and I know that an 11-year-old can't consent. And I know that rape doesn't have to happen, it doesn't have to be intercourse. It could be lots of ways that happens. And so I had this realization and I was like, how did I not see this? I've been writing this blog for a year. I've been talking about this my whole life, but I always couched it in terms of he molested me. I was like softening it. And I think just so that I could cope with it. And I finally got to the place where I had to look it in the eye and
call it
what it was. But so I got to speak at this press conference, and then we were interviewed by TV, by a couple of TV stations afterwards. And it was a really amazing experience for me. I felt like so much of my anxiety fall away, so much of my trauma fall away, because I was finally taking an action.
That's awesome.
Because when we suffer trauma, your body is saying, do something, do something, do something, do something. And part of what causes long-lasting trauma is that you're not able to do anything about it.
Wow.
And your body stays in this heightened state, which is what causes the anxiety and the
health problems,
the wakefulness, because I still don't sleep. I've struggled with sleep my whole life. And by taking that action and speaking to the cameras, I somehow was able to sort of heal a piece of that trauma. It was unexpected.
you said it a few times. It just sounds so empowering.
Yeah.
Just to talk in public about things like this.
And
it seems like it would give you some power,
Yes, and to say this is wrong, and I don't agree with this, and this is how I think it should be, and to do it and to know they're going to see me, they're going to see the newspaper article. She contacted them for comment, the whole 9 yards. They know I'm doing it, but to just sort of say, you know what, I don't care. I'm an adult now. Do your best. Whatever you're going to do, just do your best. And I think that we're taught as children to be afraid of these men, and it's not the healthy kind of fear of authority. This pastor has so much control over my life, and he's big and scary and loud. And a lot of us carry that into our adulthood. And I'm always saying to survivors, what is the worst thing they're going to do? They're going to say you're going to hell. Well, they're already saying that.
Yeah.
So it was really about me just stepping out and saying, I'm saying this, I'm saying it publicly, and I'm taking action.
They have so much more to lose than you do.
Right.
Like in a sense, you've lost everything you're going to lose.
Right, exactly.
They took that from you.
Right.
But you can... they're fearful of you. I mean, I think churches are terrified that, churches who are concealing this kind of thing are terrified that people like yourself are going to speak up because it's going to shine that light on them in the dark places, it's going to expose them. And
so their attitude now is they say we're just a bunch of disgruntled women. We're bitter. We've left the Lord. We've left, the church. And that all of this stuff was handled when it happened. But their idea of handling it, again, is not what most people in a secular society would consider to be an okay way of dealing with it.
Right. Yeah.
They have accepted no responsibility. They haven't really wanted to comment much except to say we did the right thing and these women are not. They're just disgruntled. They're bitter.
Yeah.
They're angry.
So where is this bill at now?
It's
because I know some of this came out just within the last week or so.
Yeah. So right now it's being taken around and made, accessible for electeds to read it and kind of decide whether they want to be on board. The biggest, most important thing that people can do if they want to see these bills passed is to call their electeds, their representatives here in the state of Wisconsin, and to ask them to support the bill. Because right now we don't have any Republican support and we need it.
I was going to ask how people can help. So call if you're local in Wisconsin, to call your elected official and express support for it.
Yeah, you can call, you can write. It's pretty easy. You can Google it if you don't know who your electeds are, and send them postcards. And a lot of people don't know, but they keep track of that. So you can call them every day. You can send them multiple postcards if it's something that you're really passionate about. And if you call and you get a busy signal, or you have to leave a message, it's okay. Leave a message, because they do document all of the messages that they receive. So it's worth it to keep trying and to leave messages if you can, if you have the opportunity to.
Okay, so right now they're trying to build support for the bill, is where it's at. Okay, and so this is a critical point.
So the statute of limitations bill is a bill they've been trying to pass forever, but there's so much religious resistance from all quarters, not just the Catholic Church. And as we've seen with the Church 2 movement, it isn't just the Catholic Church. It's the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's the Southern Baptists. This is a widespread problem. And so there's a lot of resistance. And we need to build support for the bill. And hopefully this time will be the time that, we're able to get it across the finish line.
Yeah.
Mandatory reporting bill is new. So this hasn't really been tried before.
I think it's great. I don't know what the law is in my state and in other states, but it does seem that the church kind of has this, like you said, like a loophole where they're kind of exempt from some of these things.
Well, and and sort of going back to like mercy and things like that, people have said to me, well, why is this the pastor's fault? Why isn't this your parents' fault? It is my parents' fault. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying that my parents shouldn't have been watching me closer and shouldn't have known what was going on in my life. But I'm saying that the person I reported to was the person who had the most authority in my life, was the person who basically made all the decisions because everybody does what he says.
Yeah.
Not only did he not report this to the police, he didn't get me any help. He never prayed with me. He never told the women of the church to pray with me. No one ever checked in and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And not only that, but there was just so much gossip about me, and I heard it, and it was horrible. It made me feel even worse about myself than I already did. And so he failed me in every way as a shepherd, as the person who had control over my whole world.
Yeah. And Jesus talks about protecting the little children. You know what I mean? Like,
he talks a lot about millstones.
Yep, that's what I thought of. Like, if you don't protect the little children, like, you better to have a millstone tied around your neck. And
But I don't think that they saw me as a child, and that was one thing I wanted to circle back around to too, is that so if you're a man, you can only date someone in the United Pentecostal Church. If there aren't a lot of girls your age in the church, then you've got to go outside of the Madison church and maybe meet a girl in Milwaukee or meet a girl in another city. Well, then you've got to have a long distance relationship. I think what happened with a lot of these men is they thought, well, will anyone comment if I date this 16-year-old? Oh, no one's saying anything. Will anyone comment if I date this 14-year-old? And so I think in a lot of ways, my case was like the test case, right? Men were watching. They saw that nothing happened. And and I feel like there are so many cases I know of men. So my abuser was 31 when I reported. Men who are in their early 30s, grooming and sort of dating girls as young as 12. And it's an open secret. Everyone in the church knows. But the attitude is, well, he's a godly man. And,
It's so weird that it's allowed like that. Yeah. But it's tolerated.
It's tolerated. But the idea is that he's a godly man, and she's lucky that this godly man is interested in her. And what they don't understand is that it isn't just dating. I mean, just dating would be bad enough. But I mean, I know people who had men trying to have intercourse with them.
Right. And how the church can just like pretend like that's okay is it's just beyond me. I don't even
especially because they're so like, sex is wrong, adultery is wrong, you should only do it when you're married.
Yeah, but pedophilia, we'll just kind of turn a blind eye to that.
Well, it's sort of like it's just not talked about. But everybody knows that these men are dating these young girls. What is a 30-year-old man going to do with a 14-year-old girl? They're not playing board games. So, it's tolerated. And that was some of what I wanted to bring out into the light, was this culture of older men with really young women, children who aren't old enough to consent. And that the church has just been sweeping this under the rug, for decades.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I, hopefully, to my Wisconsin listeners, hopefully they'll pick up their phones and help support this. And, I know a few people I've had on who are from Wisconsin, and I have some friends who live there. And so maybe I can reach out and just see if they're willing to, give a call and help support the bill.
So, I have a blog, Surviving Church and Childhood. And I'm always willing to talk to people if they want to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm pretty easy to find. Okay. But, awesome. I really have a passion for helping people that have been in similar situations. I've done a lot of work on myself around shame and worthiness and just my own sense of deserving to have a good life.
Yeah.
And
I love that you said that.
And so it's not even about it doesn't even have to be about abuse. I'm willing to talk to people about their deconversion. I've helped a lot of survivors work through that over the last year or two, because what happens is they leave and they're kind of frozen. They don't ever completely deconvert, but they also aren't really a part of the church. And so I've helped some of them just figure out what that looks like for them. And I really try to approach it from a place of, I don't care where you land. I just want to help you get through it.
Yeah, which is the most important thing, really.
Right. Because you've got your whole life to figure out what you believe. Watch YouTube videos, watch TED Talks, read books, and, listen to podcasts and take your time. It's okay. There's no rush. You don't have to know today what you believe. It's okay to be in.
Yeah. Take your time with it. Yeah. Just take it as it comes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a few questions before we say goodbye. When you look back on the person you used to be, that really devout child, you were full of fear, and just that really strict cult-like version of Christianity that you grew up in. And you think about the advocate you are today, the outspoken leader and empowered person, in some and not Christian anymore. What about you? That's a big change for a person to go through. That's a big difference in some ways, but there's always something about ourselves that stays the same. Something that's kind of your core, that's in you from an early age that you can look back at and say, this thing about myself, this was always true. Something kind of positive about yourself that you can look back on. What would that be for you?
Well, there's two things. The first one is that I care deeply about truth. And so I'm always searching for it. But now I search for it in different places. I search in science and philosophy and psychology and trying to understand why my brain works the way that it works. But I've always been curious, and I'm kind of a perpetual student. So, that hasn't changed. And this can be kind of good and bad, but I've always really identified myself as sort of a paladin.
Sort of a what?
A paladin.
What's that? Yeah, I don't even know what that is.
I have this real strong desire to do the right thing no matter what. And I tend to sort of throw myself into the fray because it's right. Not because it's easy for me or because I'm, a lot of times I'm afraid. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I've always felt this desire to do the right thing. So I think that's what has led me to being an advocate, right? Is I felt exposing my abuser, exposing the church, putting this really, personal part of myself out on the internet for anybody to read is incredibly vulnerable, but it's the right thing to do. I feel like, a lot of people have said to me oh, you said his name. Oh, you told where he lived. Oh, aren't you afraid he's going to take you to court or whatever? And I'm and say what? If he takes me to court, they're going to do an investigation. So he doesn't want that. So
right.
So my attitude is just kind of I'm sorry. This is the price you pay for taking what you took from me.
And the thing that seems to never, ever happens, these abusers never get contrite. I don't ever hear about them saying, you know what, I realize my wrongdoing and I'm going to own up to it and I'm going to make it right. However that would happen, that never happens. Mm-hmm. It's so crazy. They just perpetuate this. Like you said, they never stop.
So one part of the story I didn't tell you is that when my blog came out, I got supporters from all over the world. I was getting 1,500 hits a day on my blog, and women from all over the world shut down his church's Facebook page. He would they were posting my blog and he would take it down and another one would put it up and another one would put it up. And it was just this amazing thing where these women who didn't know me were coming out in support of me and taking this action without me asking them to do it, which I thought was amazing.
That is so cool. It's like a little army of people who are just trying to...
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so then when my husband... So my abuser had been making statements on Facebook about women and how they needed to cover up and how they were ungodly and all of this. And my husband kind of snapped one day and decided he was going to confront him. And it goes to what you were saying. He will admit to adultery. I was an adulterous, lustful person, but God has forgiven me and I'm on the right path now. But if you push him on, right, but she was 11, he won't have that discussion with you.
Wow.
It's like he just shuts down, and immediately he was saying things to my husband like, oh, you must have me confused with someone else. There's this other pedophile that lives up here. Maybe you're thinking of him. And my husband's like, no, I know it's you, and you need to answer for this. And he, just keeps going back to, well, I admitted I was a sinner. I was lustful. I was an adulterer.
Like, as if that should just let everybody should just let it go.
And my husband's like, and a pedophile.
Right?
That's when he cuts the conversation off. Like he really tries to frame it as, it's just run-of-the-mill adultery. I cheated on my wife.
God.
And
terrible.
Yeah. And so,
So these people need to be exposed.
Yes. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I did an interview with the Green Bay paper, which is the paper that's in his neck of the woods.
Nice.
A couple days ago. And, I'm just doing what I can.
Yeah, which is a lot. And I was going to say, it takes, I know when you're in the thick of it, maybe you don't think about this, but it takes, I'm sure you've thought of this, but what I'm saying is you're busy trying to make a difference, but it's very courageous of you. It's very brave of you. It's very admirable. And I just think it's so awesome because no matter how many stories there are, they all need to be told. And it helps that next person who's going through it be stronger. And it's only going to make our society better with each, story and each person that comes forward. Because not everybody not everybody has the ability the capacity. Maybe they just can't for whatever reason speak up. And so you speak for those people. And I'm thankful. I have not experienced what you did, but I'm thankful that you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting because people always tell me that I'm brave, and I don't feel brave, but I understand that that's part of being brave, right? Is doing the right thing even when you're feeling fear. Another thing too, though, is that it isn't just the abuse that happened to me. It's the whole culture of the church. When I wrote my blog, I decided I was going to cover the abuse, but I was going to cover it all. Because if I can keep one person from getting enmeshed in that culture, in that belief system, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Putting the abuse stuff aside, just the things that I suffered just being a member of that church is important to expose.
Yeah. I wanted to just share a quote really quick. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear.
Yeah.
I thought about that because it's you're courageous, and why you're courageous is you've decided no matter the outcome, like you said, no matter the cost, you're going to jump into the fray. You're going to, what's right. So you're going to go forward no matter the consequences. And that's bravery to me, pushing forward, even if the consequences could be detrimental or difficult, it doesn't matter. It's the right thing to do. So you're going to do it.
And no one ever advocated for my child self. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go back and be the person that I needed when I was a child, and I didn't have anybody there to speak for me. And I think that the one thing that all of the survivors told me I had to make sure I told you is that, it's really unfortunate in our society that women in particular, that we have to sort of bleed for people to pay attention. That, you have to be willing to put your darkest secrets out there. You have to be willing to show the emotional pain and the damage for people to pay attention, that, we don't just listen to people when they tell us that something happened. I've been telling people my whole life that this thing happened, and it was always just sort of brushed off, and it makes people uncomfortable, and they don't want to talk about it, and they want you to be okay. So it's but you're okay now. So let's just go do this fun thing.
We really have a hard time sitting with people in their pain.
Right. And so I feel like you almost have to really make a big show of it in order for people to hear. And I wish that could change.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I've never heard someone say that before, but it's sad that it's that way. You said, we have to bleed in order for people to pay attention. It's got to be so severe.
You have to put your darkest secret out there. You have to tell the really sensational, terrible thing in order for it to be taken seriously. Whereas all these years when I was this man molested me for 2 years he's pastoring a church, no one really took it seriously. But when I started to really talk about what had happened and how he had groomed me and what my life was like, then suddenly people were willing to listen.
Wow. Why do you think that is? Is it just what you said, that it's difficult for people they want you to be okay and they don't know how to handle it?
I think that's part of it. I mean, they want you to be okay. They don't know how to handle it. They don't want to be confronted with, they might have to do something to help you. You might have to get involved. And I think that when you really start to talk about the gritty details, it's hard to look away. It's much harder. I've had so many people contact me and say, I heard that this happened to you when you were a kid. These are people that were adults who have since left the church. I didn't know what to do. I still don't know what to do. But after reading your story, I can't just go back to ignoring it.
Yeah, part of the message that you're getting out is to listen. It doesn't just listen. Just take these stories more seriously.
Right.
Be willing to sit down with people and hear what they've gone through. Be more willing to do that and not, try to plug our ears and so we don't have to do something about it.
Right, or make the survivors just get louder and louder and louder, because I feel like, to me, I'm like, okay, he molested me. Okay, now it's like he raped me. But it's like I've had to get louder and more vulnerable to get people's attention. And I think we just need to really listen to people and not force them to relive their abuse in order for us to take them seriously.
Yeah, people should be advocating on your behalf and stepping up and helping you. Like, you're the ones who've gone through the trauma. Like, you should be able to, in a sense, stay on the sideline and let the people who can fight for you get out there. And yeah. So for someone who has left Christianity recently and they have gone through some kind of abuse, like you or like other people that have been on the podcast that have talked about, abuse in the church, someone like that, what encouragement would you give them in this moment in their life?
I would tell them that they're worthy. And that, when you're abused, especially as a child, that is not your sin to bear. And that for me, at least, it started with telling myself that every day. Like, you couldn't consent. You were a child. This isn't your sin. That's his sin. You didn't do anything to make this happen. And I had to keep reminding myself and reminding myself and reminding myself until I didn't have to remind myself anymore. And I would tell them that there's help out there. There's a community of people that want to help you. You just need to go find them. A really good resource, if they're Catholic in particular, is SNAP. It's a survivor network for victims of priests. And they're very active. In fact, one of their people came and spoke at the press conference that I spoke at. You can go on Twitter and just look at that Church2 hashtag, and you will find so many people that are waiting to support you. That's how I found support. I did simple things like going onto Facebook and looking up, I used to be UPC or recovering UPC. And I was able to find all of these groups that I could be a part of, and I could tell my story and get support.
That's awesome. Well, you'd mentioned that you're active, you're easy to find. What's the best way to get in touch with you if people want to do that?
Well, they can email me. That's probably the easiest way. Okay. But I'm also pretty active on Facebook and Twitter, and I have my blog, which they can contact me through.
Yeah. What do you mind giving your email?
No, it's KAORI, the number 4 EVER @yahoo.com.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. And anything that you didn't get to mention or that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get around to?
I guess I just hope that people can reach for hope. Because when I first left, I felt hopeless. I felt like if there wasn't a God, then what was all of this? life for, all of the suffering, all of the painful things I went through in my childhood. And I just kept reaching for hope. And where it ended up leading me to is life is wonderful without God. It can be wonderful. Just getting up and getting to be a part of this world that is so beautiful and unusual, right? Like, we don't know if there's another place anywhere like the earth that we live on. And I consider myself lucky to be here in this moment, living this life. And if this is all there is, that's okay. And so
that's wonderful. That's such a happy, positive note to end on.
I try.
Yeah. Well, Debbie, it's been really wonderful to meet you, and I really appreciate you sharing your story and taking the time to do this. And I really admire what you're doing, and I just hope anyone who's listening who can help, who can just pick up the phone and call a representative to help with this bill, or even just help those people in their lives who they might suspect are going through difficult times, have maybe been abused that they know of, just to be supportive of those people. And so thank you for sharing your story today and coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's been fun.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast.